Last week, so we're good. All right, well, we're in chapters 27 and 28. So last week we saw the prophecies of future destruction of all of Israel's surrounding enemies. We looked at their enemies to the east and to the west and to the north. We saw the history of those nations over the centuries, the history that they had with Israel. And then we saw the sins that they had against Israel and God, and then the future destruction that would happen to them. So we looked at Ammon and Moab and Edom and the Philistines and Tyre, which is the capital of the Phoenician territories. So in chapter 26, we saw four oracles given against Tyre, and tonight we'll delve in a little deeper into Tyre's destruction that would take place. The destruction of the city itself and the destruction of its leaders. So we'll get in a little bit more. 27 is an interesting comparison to the city when it talks about the destruction of the city, and then chapter 28 really gets into its leaders, which has a super interesting part to it as well. So we're in chapter 27. So Roman number 1 is the destruction of the city of Tyre. The destruction of the city of Tyre. So in verses 1 through 11, Ezekiel compares the city to a ship. To a ship. So point A, Ezekiel compares the city to a ship. So let's look at 1 through 11. It says, "Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, And you, son of man, take up a lamentation over Tyre, and say to Tyre, Who dwells at the entrance to the sea, merchant of the peoples, to the many coastlands? Thus says the Lord God, O Tyre, you have said, I am perfect in beauty. Your borders are in the heart of the seas. Your builders have perfected your beauty. They have made all your planks of fir trees from Sinir. They have taken a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for you, of oaks from Bashan. They have made your oars. With ivory they have inlaid your deck of boxwood from the coastlands of Cyprus. Your sail was of fine embroidered linen from Egypt, so that it became your distinguishing mark. Your awning was blue and purple from the coastlands of Lisha. The inhabitants of Sidon and Arvad were your rowers. You wise men, O Tyre, were aboard. They were your pilots. The elders of Gebal and her wise men were with you, repairing your seams. All the ships of the sea, their sailors, were with you in order to deal in your merchandise. Persia and Lud and Put were in your army, your men of war. They hung shield and helmets in you. They set forth your splendor. The sons of Arvad and your army were on your walls all around, and the Gammadim were in your towers. They hung their shields on your walls all around. They perfected your beauty. So 1 through 11, Ezekiel compares the city to that of a ship. So let's dice that up just a little bit more. Point number 1 there, the beauty of Tyre. The beauty of Tyre. Verses 1 through 4 talks about its harbor is the most beautiful in all of the world. It refers to them as the gateway to the sea. So if you're a merchant, you would be coming through that way at some point. You would deal with Tyre at some point. And we'll see that as we get going a little further. Then the second little bullet point, it's ships. So the harbor is the most beautiful in the world. It's called the gateway to the sea, and its ships are the finest in the world. Verses 5 through 7. So the builders had constructed the most beautiful ships possible. Materials from distant lands were imported for use in the vessel. The materials used emphasized the city's sound construction. Their connections with other nations would have given them what they would have considered security, because they were dealing with a lot of people. The timbers for the ship's hulls, the planks, they had been selected from the finest fir trees from Sinar. That's the Amorite name for Mount Hermon, which is just north of the Sea of Galilee. Then the ship's mast, the big thing that would hold all the sails, was made from cedar trees from Lebanon. Everybody's heard about cedar trees from Lebanon. They're known for their height and for their strength. They're exported for use in construction. Their oars were crafted of oaks from Bashan. That was the area east of the Sea of Galilee, famous for their oak forest. Now the deck itself was made of cypress wood, but in it they would inlay ivory on it. So that would have been pretty, what I would call bougie today, right? It would have been pretty. So it was inlaid with ivory. The sails were made of the finest linen from Egypt. So Tyre used 4 kinds of wood: fir, cedar, oak, and cypress. And it was inlaid ivory, and all their sails were made of the fine linen. Everybody's heard of the linens that came from Egypt. So they were purple and blue. So the beauty of Tyre, as he compares them to a ship. Next, we see the power of Tyre in verses 8 through 11. I already read those to you. The power of Tyre was recognized through their multinational crew, the repairmen, the sailors, and the soldiers that came from distant lands. The ship's glory was enhanced by a display of shields and helmets. So that first little bullet point, verses 8 and 9, we see they're sailors. They're sailors. They came from many nations to join the fleet. The crewmen of the ship were the best available. Men of Sidon and Arvid manned the oars. So they were, you can imagine what the ships looked like with the oars coming out the little holes in the side, and they were rowing like this. So Sidon and Arvid. Sidon was another seaport about 20 miles north of the city of Tyre. It was actually one of the oldest naval powers at that time. And then Arvid was an island off the coast of Syria. Both cities were known for their shipping, not like UPS shipping, but ships, those sort of things. The earliest Phoenician ships each had about 50 oarsmen. They were pretty fast. So 50 of the people, Steve would have been at the pull, or whatever he would have said. He had got him going.
Then had a song.
Yeah. The drum would have beat. And then later, commercial ships were much longer and had a crew of up to 200 with 2 or 3 banks of oars on each side. So they did grow as time went on. So that was the sailors. They just got the best of the best from all the surrounding areas. They knew this beautiful ship. They wanted to work in this ship. And then we see their soldiers is the next little bullet point. Their soldiers. So we had the power of Tyre. We looked at their sailors. Now we looked at their soldiers. Verses 10 and 11, Ezekiel describes the military and commercial activity of this mighty city that he's comparing to a ship. Tyre was protected by the best mercenary army that could be mustered. The soldiers included men from Persia, Lydia, and Put. Persia was east of Babylon, ultimately defeated by the Babylonians in 539 BC. Lydia was on the west coast of Asia Minor, which is sometimes translated as Lud, which is what my version said. And the country of Put, what has sometimes been associated with the word Punt, it's Somalia in East Africa. It's better, many people associate Put with the area of present-day Libya. If you guys are good in geography, that tells you a little bit where they are. But both Lydia and Put supplied mercenary soldiers for the Egyptian army. So they fed into the Egyptian army. Some of those people would come and work on these ships. And they would be joined by men from Arvid, Helek, and Gamad. Helek was the Akkadian name for the region of Cilicia, where the city of Tarsus was. Paul was born there. If you guys have heard of the Apostle Paul, he was born there. So that he didn't have any connection here, but it's just kind of interesting. And in the Gamad, they don't know what it is. But see, Ezekiel pictured Tyre as a strong, seaworthy vessel. She was proud of her fleet. It was built with the very best materials and manned by the very best crews. All the ships of the sea, which means other countries, and their sailors came alongside to trade for their wares. So again, he's talking about the city, but he's comparing it to the ship to give you a visual. We're visualizing this beautiful ship. He's really talking about the city. It had the finest of woods and building to build their materials. They had the best crew, the best repairmen. One of the verses talked about they had people come that would repair, like they would do when you're out on sea. They would make it seaworthy or waterproof with pitch, so that would sometimes start to leak. So they carried people on board with them that would repair that as it happened. So this was like the best of the best. When you talk about the construction of this city, this ship that we're looking at. Then Ezekiel in point B, verses 10 through 25, he lists their trading partners. In verses 10 through 25, I don't want to read them all because there's a bunch of names on there, and I'll butcher them worse than normal. But we'll go through some of them and talk about some of the things. But you can read, there's a bunch of names there, including Judah and Israel that would trade with them. So at this time in history, Tyre was one of the richest cities in the world. They traded goods with people from all over the world. In fact, Ezekiel, in these verses 12 through 25, he lists 24 nations or cities or peoples that were trading with Tyre. Among them mentioned, like I said, Israel and Judah were two of the people. An impressive array of products was transported between these ports of call. So people would come into their port, they would trade with them. Here's some of the stuff they were trading. Verse 12 talks about silver, iron, or iron, tin, and lead. Verse 13 talks about they traded slaves. Verse 14, chariot horses, steeds, and mules. Verse 15, ebony and ivory. I always thought that would be a cool band name, but that's a different thing. Verse 16 talked about emeralds and purple dyes and fine linen and jewelry of coral and rubies. Verses 17 and 18, this is what Judah and Israel will trade for: wheat and honey, oil, balm, wine, wool. And then verses 19 and 20, we see iron and saddles and claws. Verse 21, rams, lambs, goats. 22, spices and gold. 23 through 25, blue cloth, embroidery, carpets. The point is that the Phoenicians, or Tyre, had trading relations with peoples all over the ancient Near East. And to a large extent, the economy of the entire region depended on their commercial experts. Ezekiel has shown us the beauty and the power of this great nation. He has listed their impressive trading partners. We can recognize the power and influence of this nation. I mean, this was, they had it going on. And they were building wealth for themselves. They were building security through the partnerships they had with these armies and different things. They were very secure. But in verses 26 through 36, point C, Ezekiel describes how this ship sank, how the ship would sink. Verses 26 and 27 says, your rowers have brought you into the great waters. The east wind has broken you in the heart of the seas. Verse 27, your wealth, your wares, your merchandise, your sailors and your pilots, your repairers of seams, your dealers in merchandise, and all your men of war who are in you, with all your company that is in your midst, will fall into the heart of the seas on the day of your overthrow. At the sound of the cry of your pilots, the pasture lands will shake. All who handle the oar, the sailors, and all the pilots of the sea will come down from their ships. They will stand on the land. They will make their voice heard over you and will cry bitterly. They will cast dust on their heads and wallow in the ashes. Verse 31, also they will make themselves bald for you. They shave their heads and gird themselves with sackcloth, and they will weep for you in the bitterness of souls with bitter mourning. Verse 32, moreover, in their wailing they will take up a lamentation for you and lament over you. Who is like Tyre? Like her who is silent in the midst of the sea. When your wares went out from the sea, you satisfied many peoples. With the abundance of your wealth and your merchandise, you enriched the kings of earth. Now that you are broken by the seas, in the depths of the waters, your merchandise and all your company have fallen in the midst of you. All the inhabitants of the coastlands are appalled at you, and their kings are horribly afraid. They are troubled in countenance. The merchants among the peoples, hiss at you. You have become terrified. You will be no more. So he describes how the ship sank. So in verses 26 and 27, Ezekiel was building into a climax. He described in great detail the beautiful construction of the ship. and his successful commerce. Then in a lament, he described the ship's catastrophic sinking. So Tyre's destruction came in the element where she was most at home, the open sea. It's kind of interesting how God does that. Sometimes God takes what we're most proud of and humbles us through that process. If you've ever had kids, God uses kids to humble us all the time. My kid would never act like that in public. Then you take your kid to Walmart and they want something, and they start acting a fool, just like you said they would never do. Anybody here not have their kid throw a fit at a store? Yeah, it happens to all of us. Now, Terry's like, I am so old, I cannot remember that. Oh, bless your heart. They probably did it with Rich, not with you.
Yeah.
So what happens, you give them their way, they want that toy, you buy it real quickly, or you just leave the cart where you're at, you grab the kid and you walk out. And then when you get home, you have a little discussion with them, or give them the board of discipline or whatever you do. But it's interesting here, they're most at home, they're most successful in the open sea. So then he begins in the high seas. He says the east wind would break the ship to pieces. Most ships tried to stay close to the shore to avoid rough storms, but Tyre's state-of-the-art ships often ventured out away from the shore into the high seas, and boats would just come up alongside of them and they would trade their stuff. But this time they would be caught up in a violent storm. During the fall and winter, weather on the Mediterranean becomes unpredictable and travel is hazardous. A storm from the east could blow a ship away from the coast and out into the ocean where there was little chance to survive. Now it's interesting, he says that an east wind comes. Why would he say an east wind comes? Because they are defeated by Babylon, which is east of them. So it's no coincidence he said east wind. That's where Babylon was located, and they were the ones that would take Tyre out. Tyre was about to go down with the loss of all her people and all her wealth. She would sink into the heart of the sea. He goes into great details. All these people that are on board, they're all going to die. All of the money and all the things you traded for and all the wealth and all the possessions are all going to just die. They're going to drown in the sea. So verses 28 through 32, the surrounding countries. So I read through that quickly. All these other countries that were surrounded, that had done business with them, their oarsmen, their pilots, their people were all on land still. They would mourn the loss of Tyre. They would cry. They would shave their heads, sprinkle dust on their heads. They would roll in ashes. They would put on sackcloth. These were all signs of intense grief associated with personal loss. Now, we don't necessarily do that when we have a personal loss. We don't shave our heads and, roll around in ashes, throw dust on ourselves, rip our clothing, and stuff like that. But we do handle personal loss probably similarly. Kind of the same. We would call it being depressed. We'd stay in our rooms, we'd stay in our beds. We wouldn't stop coming to church while we're trying to lick our wounds. We handle things in a different way, but it's the same kind of context here. They would want the world to see that they were mourning this loss. Now, sometimes we want the world to see it. Sometimes we just want to shut the world out and be alone. So everybody handles it a little bit differently. But these people would bemoan their loss by taking up a lament concerning Tyre. So they had an interesting question. I don't know where it was. Verse 32. In their wailing, they would take up a lamentation for you, speaking of Tyre, a lament over you. Who is like Tyre? Like her who is silent in the midst of the sea. Those who traded with the once bustling city of Tyre would be appalled at the sudden loss and silencing of Tyre. They were done. And he's comparing it to a ship that's sunk. What he's saying is the city's done. It's completely taken over. Verses 33 through 36, Tyre's commercial activity had enriched others. He said, they satisfied many nations. They made many kings wealthy. Many people had benefited from their trade. And those countries would feel the loss. Those who had profited from her would be appalled, and their kings would shudder with horror and fear. These rulers were fearful because if the great city of Tyre could be destroyed by the Babylonians, their hope of escape was dim. If the Babylonians wanted to take them, there was nothing they could do about it. You think about this is a city that had great armies, mercenaries that they'd take from the best from other armies, including Egypt, places like that. They had the best repairmen, the best sailors, the best everything, and they were wiped out. So the merchants it says they would hiss, they would, through their teeth, would hiss in shock at Tyre's demise. This action was not necessarily, they weren't trying to scorn them. It was more often an expression of astonishment. These businessmen should be astonished because the pride of the fleet had come to a horrible end. They were completely destroyed. So they were in shock and just couldn't understand what happened, and that defeated them and scared them and put them in a terrible position because they were much weaker than the mighty Tyre that had just been completely destroyed.
So they didn't treat them like they did Judah, and Judah was exiled.
Yeah, they didn't laugh and rejoice and make fun of them and all those sort of things. It was hitting their pocketbook and their way of life. So they were like terribly upset that it happened because now their quality of life, their gas prices were going up, if you will. Like today. It's important to have different trade relationships with different countries throughout. The U.S. has a bunch of them. I don't know who they have, but they like to go to other places to get their resources. And when those deals go through, you feel the pinch at home. Now the U.S. is pretty strong, so we just, we pay everybody more and charge, $5 for a Big Mac, and then we all just, buck up. I was with a friend this week, and they always say, "Buck up, little camper," and I thought that was kind of interesting. I was like, I got to remember that. I need to use that next time somebody comes in with a problem. Buck up, little camper. See if that helps. I don't know if it will, but it has to be the right situation at the right time. So it won't work on everyone.
No, I don't think so.
But maybe one of you, maybe it would work out.
Why don't you test that on Stephanie and let us know?
Oh, I would try that. She's got a bad shoulder. I'll say, buck up, little kid. And we'll see how that goes. I'll give you a report next week. If I have a black eye or something, it didn't go well.
We got an extra room if you need.
I appreciate that. So that's the destruction of the city itself. He compares it to a ship. He talks about all their trading partners, the wealth and strength that would come from all those alliances they had with people. And then he'd describe how the ship would sink. It would be the east wind coming in. It would be Babylonian armies from the east would come in and completely destroy them. So this is obviously is not live, but it's something that'll happen in the future. Then chapter 28, and 28 was pretty interesting. The second half of it, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So I'll share it with you. You guys probably already saw it, but we're going to look at the destruction of the leader of Tyre. So Roman number 2 is the destruction of the leader of Tyre. So the second page is all that. There's not a lot of blanks. I left a little room in case you'd like to put a little chicken scratch around. You can do that. So point A, we see a lamentation against the earthly leader of Tyre. The earthly leader of Tyre. So let's look at chapter 28, verse 1. The word of the Lord came again to me, saying, Son of man, say to the leader of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is lifted up, and you have said, I am a God, I sit in the seat of gods, in the heart of the seas. You are a man and not God, although you make your heart like the heart of God. Verse 3. So here he's talking about, you can see, because your heart is lifted up, he's talking about pride. You act as if you're God. Verse 3, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. He's speaking of the prophet Daniel, who was at this point very well respected in Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. There's no secret that is a match for you. By your wisdom and understanding, you have acquired riches for yourself, and you've acquired gold and silver for your treasuries. By your great wisdom, by your trade, you have increased your riches, and your heart is lifted up because of your riches. Verse 6, therefore thus says the Lord God, because you have made your heart like the heart of God, therefore, behold, I will bring strangers upon you, the most ruthless of the nations, and they will draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom and defile your splendor. They will bring you down to the pit, and you will die, the death of those who are slain in the heart of the seas. You will still say, I am God, in the presence of your slayer, though you are a man and not God. In the hands of those who wound you, you will die the death of the uncircumcised by the hand of strangers, for I have spoken, declares the Lord God. Again, the word of the Lord came to me saying. Moves into the next part. So that's 1 through 10. Let me give you the points and then I'm going to talk about it. So, number 1, their earthly king. They're talking about their earthly king. It was Ethbal the third. So, that's such a great name. It's the third guy to be named that. And number 2, his sin was pride. His sin was pride. So, Ezekiel's third message against Tyre is directed specifically to the leader, or some versions say ruler, of Tyre. Ezekiel had prophesied against the whole city already. He was now singling out the city's leader for a special word from God. This ruler then was Ethbal III, who ruled from about 591 to 572 BC, in that ballpark. The underlying sin of Tyre's king was his pride, which prompted him to view himself as a god. His claim to deity is referred to again in verses 6 and verses 9. Evidently, in Ezekiel's day, the king of Tyre believed they were divine. The king's claims to deity were false, obviously. God said, you're a man and not a god. He's like, I'm about to show you you're not a god. Ethbal III was only a mortal. Evidently, he felt he had wisdom that only God could possess. So in Ezekiel uses some irony here. He says, are you as wise as Daniel? It's no secret. Is there no secret from you? The Daniel in view was the prophet Daniel. Like I said, he had already achieved a great reputation for his wisdom in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar. We find that in Daniel's chapters 1 and 2. The irony was that Ethbal III felt his wisdom exceeded that of even Daniel, who served the country that would ultimately defeat them. Daniel, who attributed his wisdom to God, was much wiser than Ethbal III, who claimed to be a god. But in his mind, he had wisdom that was even greater than Daniel's. It was wisdom that only could come from God himself, making him a god. So even though he didn't think it came from that God, he just thought he possessed that, which meant he was a god. So Ethbal III had been able to use his wisdom and skill to acquire material possessions. So this is the king of Tyre. All the trade deals, 24 different countries coming in and trading. The king would become a very wealthy person. He'd acquire much gold, much silver. And with each piece of gold that he accumulated, his pride also grows as well. We can see that in today's society sometimes too, right? Mm-hmm. We're driving a clunker for a while because it's paid off and it finally dies. So we buy a brand new car. We want to make sure everybody knows it, everybody sees it. Some of you buy a reasonable car. Some of you guys buy an expensive car. It's everybody's choice. It depends what they want, what fits your budget, what floats your boat, or whatever the case may be. You guys aren't like this way, but there are people that buy certain things because it's a status symbol. You know, if I were a professional athlete, I probably wouldn't be driving a Dodge Ram. I would have a Mercedes or a Beamer or a Ferrari or, you know, a status symbol.
Electric too.
Oh, I need an EV, yeah. Because,
Everybody wants one of those, right?
yeah.
Right. except for me. But there are things that we buy that are status. Not us necessarily, but the world. There are people that look at me. I finally have arrived. I have the yacht that I wanted, or I have the house that I wanted, or I have the car that I wanted, or I am able to take the vacations that I want, or fill in the blank. This is what was happening to the king here. As he became wealthier, became more powerful, became more influential, he's like, look how wise I am. With my great understanding and my great business acumen, I've been able to put together this impenetrable kingdom. This city that is beyond any other city. I've built a city that so many other cities are dependent upon. That's what his pride is. In verses 6 through 10 that I read already, we know that God will not let this kind of pride go unchallenged. The foreigners from God would bring against Tyre had already been identified as the Babylonians already. We know that. Babylon was ruthless in their treatment of others. Unimpressed with Ethbal's beauty and wisdom, Babylon would destroy him in a violent way in the heart of the sea. When slain by his enemies, it would be evident that he was no God. They would make sure. You think about how the Romans and some of the Jewish leaders did that with Jesus. They wanted to make sure that everyone knew he was not the King of Kings. He was not the King of the Jews. So what they do? Well, if you're the king, bring yourself down off the cross. Or, they even put stuff on the sign to make fun of him. Oh, I thought you were a king, even one of the thieves. Or, if you're all this, get us down off of this. Now, how would it prove the guy that's being crucified next to me? I like how he does that. If you're really the king, bring us all down. He doesn't say just bring yourself down. He's like, hey, how about me? And this is kind of how the king, when Babylon took him, they wanted them to know this guy was no God. He was a mere mortal. So they finally slew him, and it said Ethbal would die the death of the uncircumcised at the hands of the foreigners. While the Phoenicians practiced circumcision, Ezekiel's words conveyed a meaning that went beyond this cultural practice. To die the death of the uncircumcised meant to die in shame. The king who claimed to be a god would suffer just a terrible death. I mean, that's what they did to Jesus. There was no more shame than for a Jew to be crucified. That's what they did to Jesus. He would die the death of the uncircumcised. He would die in shame. Upon his death, Nebuchadnezzar would put in Baal II was put in his place. So Nebuchadnezzar put his ruler to rule over what was left there. So that's the lamentation against the earthly leader. Then in verses 11 through 19, it switches from ruler to king. So lamentation against their spiritual king. Against their spiritual king. And you can see there's a little blank left. Who he's talking about here is Satan. So Satan. The change from using the word leader to king was also significant in the light of the context of these two prophecies. In verses 1 through 10, Ezekiel rebuked the leader of Tyre for claiming to be a god, though he was just a man. But in verses 11 through 19, Ezekiel described the king of Tyre in terms that could not apply to mere men. This king had appeared in the Garden of Eden, had been a guardian cherub, had possessed free access to God's holy mountain, and had been sinless from the time he was created. So Ezekiel switched from leader to king, and his reference back to the Garden of Eden do imply that the individual being described was more than human. Some scholars try to give a bunch of stuff, but the best explanation is that Ezekiel was describing Satan, who was the true king of Tyre, the one motivating the human ruler of Tyre. Satan was in the garden. We know that from Genesis chapter 3. And his chief sin was pride. How did he get out of heaven? Pride. He also had access to God's presence. We know that from our study in Job. Speaking of God's judging the human leader of Tyre for his pride, the prophet lamented that the satanic king of Tyre was also judged for pride. We'll see that in just a minute. Tyre was motivated by the same sin as Satan and would suffer the same fate. So in Ezekiel's description of the king of Tyre, we'll see, first of all, verses 12 through 14. Number one there, Satan's privileges before his fall. Satan's privileges before his fall. So let's look at verses. We'll just go through 12 through 14 and then do the rest in a minute. So in verse 11, he says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the lapis, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold, the workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you on the day that you were created. They were prepared. Verse 14, you were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. So here we see Satan's privileges before his fall. Ezekiel described the beauty and perfection of Satan as God originally created him. Verses 12 through 14. Satan was the cream of the crop. He was the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. We all see Satan is this, has horns and a pitchfork and a tail. Actually, Satan was the most beautiful of all angels that were ever created. He was perfect in his body, in his appearance. God did not create Satan as some prime minister of evil. As with all of God's creation, Satan was a perfectly created being. One of his crowning achievements of all the angels that he created. So he didn't create Satan bad. Satan had many privileges. He was given an exalted place. He was in Eden, the garden of God. Eden was the epitome of God's beautiful creation on earth. It was a perfect place. Satan was the epitome of all of his angels. He had access to the perfect place, the Garden of Eden. Satan's beauty matched that of Eden. Every precious stone adorned him. Ezekiel listed 9 gemstones that I rattled off, describing Satan's beauty. These were 9 of the 12 kinds of stones that were worn on the breastplates of Israel's high priest that we looked at in Ezekiel chapters 28 and again in 39. The precious stones probably symbolized Satan's beauty and high position. God had anointed Satan as a guardian cherub. The cherubim were the inner circle of angels who had the closest access to God and guarded his holiness. Think about that for a second. Satan was created to guard God the Father's holiness. Satan also had free access to God's holy mountain, verse 14 tells us, which is heaven. And he walked among the fiery stones. Some associate the fiery stones with the precious gems, but they're not exactly the same. The precious gems, they describe his appearance. But in verses 14 and 16, part of the abode where Satan dwelt. So the places that he could go. They see Satan dwelling inside or behind God's outer defenses in the inner courts of heaven itself. This view is possible. The word translated among can have the idea of between or inside. So Ezekiel stated that Satan has access to God's presence. That's how he was created. When I was a kid, they always taught us there was 3 archangels and Satan was one of them, Lucifer. You had Michael, who was the fighting angel. You had Gabriel, who was the messenger angel. And then Lucifer was the other archangel, the other greatest of all the angels. And he was in charge of
a lot of things, but one of them was music. That's how I was always brought up, and I think about that now. I mean, how much does Satan use music
Oh, yeah.
to lead people astray even today?
Yeah.
So I can almost see it like Lucifer would have been the worship leader, if you will, in heaven. He was the inner circle with God. He was the protector of God's holiness. He would be the one that would sing about God's holiness. That's how he was created. As originally created by God, Satan was blameless. Verse 15, and interesting words there. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. So I don't know how long this was. I don't know. I mean, it probably wasn't just a week or two. God lives outside of time. So we don't know how long Satan was in heaven. I don't know that. Maybe some of you have studied that. It would be conjecture at best. We just don't know. But you were blameless the entire time, from the time I created you until unrighteousness or wickedness was found in him. Verse 16 that we'll look at in a second, he sinned. The sin that corrupted Satan was self-generated. Created blameless, his sin was pride. Because of his beauty, his wisdom, his position, Satan spoiled his wisdom because of his splendor. King Ethbal had a similar problem. Because of his wisdom, the beauty of his city, the wealth of his city, the positions that he had, and the influence and power that he had, he fell at pride. Satan, the one that is the one maneuvering behind the scenes, is all the same. Because of his great beauty, because of his wisdom, because of his position in heaven, in the heavenly government, the heavenly kingdom itself, Satan's pride led to his fall and his judgment as well. I really thought that was kind of interesting as you look at the earthly king, and then if you look at the satanic king behind the scenes, the correlation there, wisdom and beauty and power and position is all the same. Then we look at verse 16, number 2 there, we see the judgment on Satan. The judgment on Satan. Verse 16, by the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you. By the multitude of your iniquities, in the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. Therefore I have brought fire from the midst of you. It has consumed you, and I have turned you to ashes on the earth in the eyes of all who see you. So the judgment on Satan. Though Ezekiel presented the fall of Satan as a single act, it actually occurred in stages. Satan's initial judgment was his expulsion from the position of God's anointed cherub before his throne. Remember when we were was it earlier in Ezekiel, or when we saw the cherubs that were holding up the throne? He was cast out of that. God expelled him from the mount of God, from heaven. Satan was cast from God's government in heaven, but was still allowed access to God. We know that he still has access. God calls a meeting with all the people. Satan attends. We saw that in Job. Now, in the tribulation, Satan will be cast from heaven permanently and restricted to just earth. And then
What does it mean by trade?
Oh, where they're talking about? He's going to refer a little bit back to the king, the earthly king as well.
Through your widespread trade.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So in the tribulation, Satan will be cast from heaven, restricted just to earth. In millennial, he'll be in the bottomless pit. And after his brief release at the end of the millennium, he'll be cast in the lake of fire forever. So let me see where I've got that. So I wrote that same thing down. Ezekiel was described as the ultimate ruler of Tyre, Satan. The purpose of the lament was to speak of the city's destruction, so he began to blend the characteristics of the satanic king with the human ruler. So the verse that you're talking about, in the abundance of your trade, or in the widespread of your trade, you are internally filled with violence. Satan would be cast to the earth, and the king of Tyre would also be cast down before his kings, his enemies. Satan's ultimate destiny would be the lake of fire, and the death and defeat of the human ruler of Tyre was pictured as being consumed by fire. Both Satan's and Tyre's defeats would shock the nations who had followed them. They're appalled because of Satan's and Tyre's horrible end. So the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence and you sinned. So the king of Tyre, their merchants, those things, would many times resort to violence to make sure the trades happened the way they were supposed to, or the way they wanted them to happen. We see that even today. There are companies that will strong arm people into deals out of desperation, and they'll be filled with violence. We have Luigi or whatever that's going to come and break your arm or whatever. We don't see that with reputable companies, but if you need a loan, I can get you a special loan, but I may change the loan at any time. If you don't like it, I can send out somebody to talk to you.
I was reading on Google, and it was saying that a lot of our major companies are now owned by other countries, and a lot of them are owned by China.
Yeah. China's buying up a lot of things, and even agriculture land and stuff.
Yeah.
They're buying a lot of farmland and stuff.
Even in Huntington County, they own
Yeah.
some land.
So China's something to keep your eye on. So it's kind of interesting. He talks about the city, then he talks about its leader, its earthly leader, then the satanic ruler, the king behind it was Satan, and he refers back to Satan, where his position was, his beauty, his power, all this stuff, how he fell. Then he swings back to the earthly king and says, remember, you were prideful here, and you were violent here, and you were cheating people here, and you were dishonest. And then their end is going to be very similar. Tyre will eventually be burned to the ground. In his example, they sunk to the sea. Satan will eventually be cast in the lake of fire for all of eternity. So I thought that was kind of interesting as I looked at that, and it referred back to, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. It's interesting to me that thousands of years later, it goes all the way back to the very beginning again, with Satan, and how he was perfect from the very beginning. He was blameless until they find sin. Now we know that once Adam sinned, all of us as mankind, we don't come out blameless. We come out with a sinful nature. But he was a created angel. He didn't have a sinful nature necessarily until he developed one. All of his problems were self-inflicted wounds in this case. And then the last part of the chapter here talks about judgment against Sidon, verses 20 through 26. So that's point C. Judgment against Sidon. This judgment against Sidon begins the same way as the oracles against Tyre. The word of the Lord came to me. Sidon is a sister city of Tyre, about 20 miles farther up to the Mediterranean coast. Because of their close association, Ezekiel may have used this same introductory formula to link the two cities of judgment. Sidon was so closely allied with Tyre that perhaps Ezekiel felt it was unnecessary to cite all of the same sins. She had violated God's holy character, and he would not allow her to remain unpunished. He would gain glory within Sidon and show himself holy. God's judgment would be a plague and the sword. So verses 20 through 23, number one, there we see the fall of Sidon.
the fall of Sidon. There was the judgment of Sidon would have two results. Let's look at verse 20. Where the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face towards Sidon, prophesy against her, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Sidon. I shall be glorified in your midst. Then they will know that I am the Lord, when I execute judgment on her. And I shall manifest my holiness in her. For I shall send pestilence to her, and blood to her streets, and the wounded will fall in her midst, by the sword upon her on every side. Then they will know that I am the Lord. So the judgment would really have two results. It would force the people of Sidon to acknowledge God's righteous character. They will know that I am the Lord. When he says you have pride and violence and you're disobedient, you're dishonest, you're all these things, I will humble you, I will destroy you, I will exact my revenge on you, because revenge is reserved for God. Then they will acknowledge that I'm the Lord. And then the second thing, the judgment would remove an obstacle to Israel's walk with God. Their malicious neighbors, with their wicked influence on Israel, had been a pain in Israel's side for a long time. See, the sinful practice of Baal worship had entered Israel through Jezebel's daughter, Jezebel, who was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. So, invading armies and terrible plagues would devastate both the land and the people of Sidon. They had been influences on the people of Israel for years and years to worship Baal. And Israel was taught over and over again, and it was proven over and over again to them that God was the only God. They should worship no other gods. But when God didn't answer it quick enough or answer it the way he wanted to, they would often turn to other gods. They would be influenced by other nations, that they would marry their women, and then they would be taught and influenced about certain other gods. The people of Sidon had done that for years with the Israelites, and God was going to take care of that. So we see the fall of Sidon. And then verses 24 through 26, number 2, the last blank there, was the restoration of Israel. The restoration of Israel. The second part of Ezekiel's prophecy against Sidon focused on the results of the destruction for Israel. How would it affect Israel? Verse 24 says, And there will be no more for the house of Israel a prickling briar or painful thorn from any round about them who scorned them. Kind of a pain in the side, a pain in the neck. And then they will know that I am the Lord God. Thus says the Lord God, when I gather the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered, and shall manifest my holiness in them in the sight of the nations, then they will live in their land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. They will live in it securely, and they will build houses, plant vineyards, and live securely when I execute judgment upon all who scorn them round about them. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. So we see the restoration of Israel here, as God would reveal his holiness by destroying Sidon. So he would reveal his holiness by rescuing Israel from the nations. Several times in the book of Ezekiel, God said, I will show myself holy. God punished Israel for her sin. She was taken into Egypt. She was taken into Babylon in captivity for years. But he never abandoned Israel. They were unique among all nations, because God had established a covenant with them. Though all nations would be punished, only Israel was promised a restoration of fellowship with God. God destroyed these nations, never to be with them again, but he never destroyed all of Israel. He would take them into captivity. How many died in the wilderness? Tons and tons. But there was always a promise of restoration. There was always a remnant left. The land promised to Abraham and renewed by Jacob had not been revoked. Israel will live in her land because God had given it to Jacob. Restored to the land, Israel will enjoy God's blessings, including safety and prosperity. This promise made through Ezekiel has never been literally fulfilled. It awaits fulfillment in the millennial kingdom, when Israel will take over the land that they were promised. After the Babylonian captivity, some Israelites did go back to the land. We saw that in Nehemiah.
Yeah.
Some of them went back to the land, but they did not live there in peace and safety.
Right.
How many people live there in peace and safety now? There's bombings almost every day in Israel,
At least.
even today. We were over there for 9-10 days. There were bombings when we were there. We heard the sirens go off, and that's just a way of life. Earthquakes and bombings happen all the time. You don't live in peace and security if you're in Israel. But when God finally punishes Israel's enemies, he blesses his chosen people. They will be regathered, regenerated, and restored to the land, and they will finally and forever recognize God as their Lord and their God. So that's what we have in chapters 27 and 28. Any thoughts that you had when you studied, or any additions or subtractions maybe that you noticed when you were going through